The Arizona sun has a way of bleaching secrets, but some are buried so deep, only blood can bring them to the surface. In 1878, near the unforgiving border of the Navajo Nation, a lone cabin burned against the twilight sky, its smoke carrying the last whispers of a slaughtered family. One survivor, a young woman named Abigail Hobbs, fled into the canyons praying for rescue from any man so long as he wasn't Navajo. But when she collapsed at the edge of death, the shadow that fell over her was the one she feared most. What happened next was not a simple tale of captive and captor. It was an alliance forged in ashes, a hunt for a devil hiding in plain sight, and a single unthinkable choice that would rewrite the story of justice in the dust of the unforgiving West. The world of Abigail Hobbs smelled of pine resin, damp earth, and the sweet, yeasty aroma of her mother's sourdough starter. It was a small world, a 30-acre homestead, carved from the stubborn red soil of the Arizona Territory, pressed up against the San Juan River. It was a world bordered by the towering, silent mesas that stood like ancient sentinels, and the ever-present unspoken understanding of the line that separated their land from that of the Diné, the Navajo people. Her father, Thomas Hobbs, was a man of calloused hands and quiet conviction. He believed in God-hard work and the Winchester rifle that hung above the stone hearth. Her younger brother, Samuel, just 17, was all sharp angles and restless energy, his mind already wandering to prospects of gold and silver whispered in the dusty streets of distant towns. On that fateful August evening, the air was thick and still, promising a thunderstorm that refused to break. Abigail was mending a tear in Samuel's canvas trousers by the flickering lamplight, the rhythmic push and pull of the needle a familiar comfort. Thomas was outside securing the livestock in the small corral, his low whistling carrying on the breeze. Samuel was cleaning his rifle, the metallic scrape and click echoing the chirping of crickets in the tall grass. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a silence. The crickets stopped, all at once. Thomas's whistling ceased mid-tune. Abigail's hand froze, the needle poised over the canvas. She looked at Samuel, whose head was cocked, his eyes wide and fixed on the cabin's single-shuttered window. Pa Samuel called out his voice, a reedy whisper. The only answer was the sudden, terrified braying of their mule, cut short with a sickening wet thud. Then the world exploded. The wooden door burst inward, splintering from its leather hinges as a figure silhouetted against the dying light lunged into the room. He was tall, broad, his face obscured by streaks of red and black paint. A feathered talisman hung from his neck, and in his hand was a war axe that seemed to drink the lamplight. Samuel, reacting on pure instinct, raised his half-assembled rifle like a club. The attacker was too fast. The axe swung in a blur, and Samuel fell without a sound, his life stolen before a scream could form on his lips. Abigail's own scream was a raw, primal thing, a tear in the fabric of the evening. More figures poured into the small cabin, their movements swift and silent, a whirlwind of violence. Another man, this one wielding a heavy cavalry pistol, grabbed Abigail by the hair, yanking her back. The rough texture of his deerskin leggings scraped against her cheek. Deerskin, not wool. The detail registered in some distant, analytical part of her brain, a strange island of clarity in a sea of terror. She saw her father burst through the now open doorway, his face a mask of rage, his Winchester roaring to life. One of the invaders staggered back, clutching his chest, but there were too many. Another shot, this one from the side, caught Thomas in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell to his knees, his eyes finding Abigail's, for a fleeting, desperate moment. It was a look of anguish, of apology, of a father's ultimate failure to protect his child. Then a knife flashed, and the light in his eyes went out forever. The man holding Abigail shoved her toward the floor. "Stay down," he grunted, his voice, a low, gravelly English, not the melodic tongue of the Diné she'd occasionally heard from traders. The command was another crack in the facade, another detail that didn't fit. But there was no time to process it. They were ransacking the cabin now, not with the careful search of thieves, but with the destructive fury of vandals. They overturned the flour barrel, smashed the precious few jars of preserved peaches, and tore the family Bible its pages, scattering like fallen leaves. They were looking for something. What she couldn't fathom. Their small homestead held nothing of value but the sweat and blood they had poured into it. One of the men barked a command in a guttural language she didn't recognize. It wasn't Navajo. The man holding the pistol pointed it towards the roof. He fired, and the sound was deafening in the small space. A moment later, a lick of orange flame appeared where the bullet had struck the dry thatch. Fire! They were burning everything. Panic gave her strength. As her captor's attention was momentarily diverted by the growing flames, Abigail twisted, biting down hard on the hand that held her arm. The man roared in pain, his grip loosening just enough. She scrambled away, crawling over the lifeless body of her brother, the warm stickiness of his blood soaking into the knees of her dress. She reached the back wall, fumbled for the small hide-covered opening they used for ventilation in the summer, and wriggled through. She fell into the dirt outside, gasping for air thick with smoke. Shouts erupted from the cabin behind her. She didn't hesitate. She ran. She ran with the fire at her back and the ghosts of her family in her heart, plunging into the labyrinth of canyons and ravines that began where her father's land ended. For 2 days, she moved like a phantom. Thirst became a physical torment, her tongue thick and swollen. Hunger was a dull ache that she learned to ignore. Fear was her only constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach that tightened with every snapped twig, every shadow that danced in the moonlight. She tore a strip from her petticoat to bind a gash on her arm, a wound she didn't remember receiving. Her dress was in tatters, her face and hands scratched raw by unforgiving scrub brush. She knew she was dying. On the 3rd day, her legs gave out. She collapsed in the meager shade of a juniper tree, the blackness closing in around the edges of her vision. The world had been reduced to the rasp of her own breathing and the merciless glare of the sun on red rock. She prayed for rescue, for a prospector or a cavalry patrol. Anyone. When she heard the soft crunch of a footstep on the gravel nearby, a flicker of hope ignited within her. She tried to lift her head to call out, but the shape that blocked the sun was not what she had prayed for. He was Navajo. There was no mistaking it. His long black hair was bound in a traditional tsiel. He wore simple buckskin trousers and a woven belt. High cheekbones and a strong jaw gave his face a severe carved look. But it was his eyes that held her. They were dark, ancient, and held no pity, only a calm, unnerving assessment. In his hand, he held a simple hunting bow. This was it. The end. The stories she'd heard in hushed tones around campfires came rushing back, tales of savage vengeance, of brutal retribution for the white man's encroachment. He would finish the job his brethren had started. Abigail closed her eyes, the last of her strength failing her. Tears mixed with the dust on her cheeks. Her lips, cracked and bleeding, formed the words, a final desperate plea, not for her life, but for the end of her suffering. "Please," she whispered, her voice a barely audible croak. "Just make it quick." The warrior knelt beside her. She flinched, expecting the cold touch of a blade. Instead, she felt the cool, smooth surface of a clay canteen being pressed against her lips. He said nothing, his dark eyes watching her with an intensity that was more terrifying than any threat. Water, precious and clean, trickled into her mouth. It was an act of mercy, an act of life. And in that moment, it was the most unthinkable thing he could have possibly done. The water was a shock to her system, a jolt of life that was almost painful. Abigail coughed, sputtering, as the Navajo warrior patiently tilted the canteen. He allowed her only a few sips before pulling it away, his expression unreadable. He knew, as any man of the desert did, that too much water too fast would kill a person in her state. He worked with an economy of motion that was both mesmerizing and intimidating. From a leather pouch at his belt, he produced a small hard cake of what looked like dried berries and cornmeal. He broke off a tiny piece and offered it to her. Hesitantly, she took it, her fingers brushing his. His skin was warm and dry, not the touch of a monster, but of a man. The food was bland and gritty, but it was sustenance, and a small spark of strength returned to her limbs. He examined the gash on her arm without a word, his touch surprisingly gentle. He then walked to a nearby creosote bush, stripped a few leaves and crushed them between two stones. The sharp medicinal scent filled the air. He applied the green paste to her wound, and while it stung fiercely, she could almost feel it drawing out the fire of infection. Every action he took was a contradiction to the horror that was seared into her memory. The men who had destroyed her home were a whirlwind of chaotic violence. This man was the opposite, deliberate calm, purposeful. The painted invaders had shouted in a guttural tongue. This man was utterly silent. She watched him through slitted, wary eyes. He was not a young brave, but a man in his prime, perhaps 30 years of age. There were lines of sorrow or hardship etched around his eyes that the sun alone could not account for. He moved with the quiet grace of a predator, yet his hands offered only healing. The paradox terrified her more than outright brutality would have. She was a mouse, and a hawk was tending to her broken wing. Why, he let her rest, sitting on his haunches a few feet away, his gaze sweeping the surrounding landscape. He was not watching her, but watching for something. The sun began its descent, painting the mesas in hues of orange and deep purple. When she felt strong enough to sit up, he finally spoke. His voice was low and raspy, his English marked by the distinct cadence of the Diné tongue, but it was clear. "They will come back for you." The words hit her like a physical blow. Who she croaked, the men who burned your home. He turned his dark eyes on her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something beyond stoic observation. It was a cold, burning fire. "The men you run from. Your people." She began the accusation, raw in her throat. He cut her off, not with a shout, but with a quiet, sharp shake of his head. "Not my people, not Diné." Abigail stared at him, confusion warring with the ingrained prejudice of her upbringing. "But the paint, the feathers, I saw them." "You saw what they wanted you to see," he said. He stood and walked to a patch of sandy earth, then knelt. With a stick he drew a shape in the dirt. It was the clear, distinct outline of a boot-print one with a worn heel and a small circular maker's mark on the sole. "Diné wear moccasins, or we go barefoot. We do not wear the boots of the Bilagayana," he said, using the Navajo word for the white man. "The soldiers from the fort, or the prospectors." He then reached into his pouch and pulled out a small brass object, glinting in the last rays of sun. He tossed it into her lap. It was a spent cartridge casing. "Springfield Model 1873. She said the words coming out automatically. Her father had taught both her and Samuel to identify firearms and their ammunition. The cavalry uses them. The warrior nodded slowly. "The men who attacked you used these. My people have few rifles, old ones, Henry Spencer's, gifts from traders, not the guns of the pony soldiers. A chasm of uncertainty opened up in Abigail's mind. The details she had noticed but couldn't process, the English command, the non-Navajo language, the deerskin leggings that were more common among Apache scouts or white trappers, all clicked into place. The boot print. The cartridge. It was a lie. The entire massacre had been a monstrous lie. But why, she whispered, looking at him, truly seeing him for the first time, not as a faceless savage, but as a man with answers. Why would anyone do that? He stood and walked to the edge of the small bluff, looking out over the vast, darkening landscape that was his home. His reply, when it came, was heavy with a grief that seemed to seep into the very air around them. They did the same to my family, he said, his voice dropping so low she had to strain to hear it. 2 moons passed. My wife, my son, they were harvesting corn by the river. Men came, dressed as Nakai, he said, using the word for Mexicans or Spanish. They burned our hogan. He trailed off, his jaw tight. He did not need to finish the sentence. The same unspeakable horror connected them, 2 souls from warring worlds, now bound by the same thread of tragedy. My name is Hastin, he said, turning back to her. It wasn't a name so much as a title she knew, one of respect, meaning man or elder. He was giving her a title, not a personal name. A wall remained between them. The man who leads these killers is called Josiah Finch. He wants the land, all of it. He wants the water from the river. And he has found something else in the hills, something that makes him greedy. He creates a war that does not exist. He makes the white man hate the Diné, and the Diné fear the white man. He hopes the cavalry will come drive us from our homes so he can take what is left. Abigail's mind reeled. Josiah Finch. She knew the name, a wealthy prospector who had bought up claims all over the territory. He was known for his ambition and his ruthlessness, but no one suspected this. He was a celebrated figure in the nearby settlements, a man bringing progress and prosperity, a man who had even shared a drink with her father in town once. You are now a problem for him. Hastin continued, his voice devoid of sympathy. You saw them. You heard their real voices. You are a witness, a loose end. They are not hunting for a victim who escaped. They are hunting for a witness who can hang them. A cold dread, deeper and more terrifying than her fear of the warrior, settled over her. She was not just a survivor. She was a target. You have to help me, she pleaded, scrambling to her feet, her legs still unsteady. Take me to Fort Defiance. The army will listen to me. We can tell them what happened. Hastin gave a short, bitter laugh. The army will listen to the word of a frightened woman over a man like Finch. A man who donates money to their fort, who supplies them with beef. They will hear your story, call it hysteria, and send you away, and Finch will hear that you are there. You will not live to see another sunrise. Then what do I do? She cried, desperation fraying the edges of her voice. Hastin stepped closer, and the full weight of his presence fell upon her. The fire was back in his eyes, a controlled, deadly inferno. This was not a rescue. She had misunderstood everything. You asked me to make it quick, he said, his voice a low whisper that sent a chill down her spine, despite the desert heat. Death is quick, but you are more useful to me, alive. He reached out not to strike her, but to gently touch the singed hem of her dress. To Josiah Finch, and to the world Abigail Hobbs died in that fire with her family. She is a ghost, and a ghost can move where a living woman cannot. The unthinkable act was not the water. It was not the medicine for her wounds. The unthinkable act was his plan. He was not saving her out of kindness. He was not her rescuer. You will not go to the fort. He declared, his voice hard as canyon rock. You will not run. You will come with me. You will be my eyes and my ears in the world of the white man. You will help me find the proof to destroy Finch. You will help me get my justice. He paused, his dark eyes boring into hers. And in doing so, you might find your own. He wasn't asking. He was telling her. The choice she thought she had to live or to die had been a fantasy. He had given her a third option, a terrifying path that led not to safety, but deeper into the heart of the very danger she had fled. He had saved her life only to claim it for his own purpose. She was his prisoner, his tool, his ghost. The first week of their journey was a silent hell. Hastine set a grueling pace, moving not along established trails, but through the broken, merciless back country. He seemed to flow over the landscape, his moccasined feet finding purchase on treacherous scree slopes and narrow ledges where Abigail stumbled and scrambled her worn leather shoes, offering little grip or protection. He was a demanding teacher, and a silent one. He did not offer words of encouragement, only sharp, clipped commands. He taught her to walk without sound, to place her feet heel to toe, to minimize dust and noise. He showed her which plants were edible, the bitter roots of the yucca, the tart berries of the squaw bush, and which would offer a slow, agonizing death. He taught her how to find water, not in pools, but by digging in the sand of a dry wash where the cottonwoods grew their roots, a living map to the moisture below. Abigail's grief was a constant physical weight. In the quiet moments, the faces of her father and Samuel would flash in her mind's eye, their last moments replaying with horrifying clarity. She would choke back sobs, pushing the memories down, knowing that any display of weakness would earn nothing but cold indifference from her captor. He had his own ghosts. He had no room for hers. Mistrust was a chasm between them. At night, she would lie awake, every nerve alight, watching the way he sat by the small, smokeless fire. He built his back always to a rock face, his gaze constantly scanning the darkness. He was hunting, and he was being hunted, and she was the bait. He had made that much clear. Finch's men would be looking for her body. When they didn't find it, they would look for her. The incident happened on the 5th day. They were traversing a narrow canyon when the distinct sound of shod horses echoed from the canyon walls. Hastine grabbed her arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her behind a cluster of massive boulders. He pressed a finger to his lips, his eyes narrowed. 2 riders came into view, their figures shimmering in the heat. They wore dusty trail clothes, their faces grim and sunburnt. They were white men armed with rifles and Colt revolvers. Abigail recognized one of them instantly. Jedediah Kane, a hulking, bearded man who worked as Finch's foreman. He'd been to their homestead once with Finch to discuss grazing rights. His eyes, small and cruel, had lingered on her then, making her skin crawl. Nothing, the other man grumbled, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a glove. It's been days. The coyotes probably got what was left of her. Finch wants to be sure, Jedediah rasped, his voice carrying in the still air. The girl was tough. I'll give her that. If she's alive, she's a problem. A big one. They rode on, their voices fading. Abigail stayed frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs. They were talking about her. They were hunting her. Hastine had been right about everything. The abstract danger had become terrifyingly real, with a familiar, leering face. When they were gone, Hastine relaxed his grip. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something akin to shared experience in his eyes. He didn't need to say, "I told you so." The shared threat had for a moment bridged the gap between them. That night he spoke more than he had in the previous 5 days, combined. Josiah Finch has a base, he said, staring into the flames of their tiny fire. A town called Redemption. It is south of here near the Chuska Mountains. He built it. He owns the saloon, the general store, the assay office. He is the law there. We're going there, Abigail asked, her voice trembling slightly. Into his town. Not we, Hastine corrected. You. The fear returned, cold and sharp. Me, they'll recognize me. Jedediah saw me. He saw a homesteader's daughter with dirt on her face, Hastine countered. You will be someone else. A widow, perhaps. Looking for work. People see what they expect to see. They will not be looking for Abigail Hobbs serving whiskey in a saloon. He paused, then did something that surprised her. He told her his story. Not just the stark facts of the massacre, but the small details that gave it weight and texture. He spoke of his wife, Ashki, whose name meant boy, because she had been as tough and fearless as any of them. He spoke of her laugh, of the way she could weave blankets that told stories in their patterns. He spoke of his son Destian, who was only 6 winters old and had just learned to fletch his own small arrows. Finch's men, they did not just kill them, Hastine said, his voice a low growl of contained fury. They left them as a warning, displayed, to terrorize my people, to make us look like vengeful savages when we retaliate. As he spoke, he was no longer the silent, stoic warrior. He was a husband and a father, hollowed out by a grief as profound as her own. His pain was not a weapon to be used against her, but a mirror reflecting her own shattered heart. For the first time, she felt a flicker of something other than fear or resentment toward him. It was a fragile, reluctant empathy. My father. Thomas, she found herself saying the name, feeling strange on her tongue. It felt good to say it aloud. He met with Finch once, in town. Finch wanted to buy our land, said the soil was no good for farming, but might have other minerals. Pa refused. He said the land was our future. Samuel's future. Hastine looked up from the fire, his eyes locking with hers. Finch does not like to be refused. A terrible thought began to form in Abigail's mind. The attack hadn't been random. It wasn't just part of a larger campaign of terror. It had been specific, targeted. Her father had been in Finch's way. The journey changed after that night. The silence between them was no longer one of animosity, but of shared purpose. He still pushed her, but there was a new element to his teaching. He was not just training a survivor, he was honing a weapon. He taught her to use a knife, not just for skinning rabbits, but for defense. He showed her how to use her small stature to her advantage, to strike at vulnerable points. He made her repeat the details of their plan, her new identity, her backstory, until it felt almost real. They traveled for another week, finally reaching the scrubby hills overlooking the town of Redemption. It lay in a dusty bowl of a valley, a single muddy street lined with a dozen or so wooden buildings. A large 2-story saloon and hotel dominated the town, a gaudy sign proclaiming it the Finch Nest. Smoke plumed from the chimney of a blacksmith's shop and a distant assay office. It looked like any other desperate frontier town, but Abigail knew it was a spider's web, and Josiah Finch sat at its center. Hastine gave her a small pouch containing a few silver dollars he had taken from a prospector he'd found dead in the desert months ago. He had also traded with a wandering trader for a plain dark-colored dress, much more suitable for a grieving widow than her tattered homestead clothes. "Remember who you are," he said, his voice low and urgent, as they hid in the rocks above the town. "You are Sarah Connolly. Your husband died of fever on the trail from Santa Fe. You have no money, no family. You are looking for any work to survive. And you? She asked, looking at his proud, distinctly Navajo features. He could never enter that town. I will be close, he said, gesturing to the rocky hills that surrounded the valley. I will watch. You are the ghost. Go where I cannot. Listen. Find the proof Finch keeps. A ledger, a map, a letter. Something that will convince the army at Fort Defiance that he is the monster, not my people. She looked down at the town at the lion's den she was about to willingly enter. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee back into the desert. But then she thought of her father's last look of Samuel lying in his own blood. And she thought of a woman named Ashki and a little boy named Destiun. Their ghosts were walking with her now. Taking a deep breath, Abigail Hobbs, the farmer's daughter, died one last time in the hills above Redemption. In her place, a hollow-eyed widow named Sarah Connolly began the long, dusty walk into town. The dust of Redemption's main street coated Abigail's tongue and clung to the back of her throat. It was a town built on greed and desperation, and she could feel it in the air. Men with hard, watchful eyes paused to stare at her as she walked, their gazes lingering with a mixture of suspicion and predatory interest. Women peered from behind grubby windows, their faces pinched and weary. This was Finch's kingdom, and these were his subjects. Her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs, but she kept her face, a mask of weary grief. Her shoulders slumped, her eyes downcast. She was Sarah Connolly. She was a ghost. She repeated the mantra in her head until it became a shield. Her destination was the largest building in town, the Finch Nest. It was a saloon, a hotel, and likely the seat of Finch's power. If she wanted to get close to him, to his men, this was the place. Pushing through the swinging bat-wing doors was like entering another world. The air was thick with the smells of stale beer, sweat, and cheap perfume. A tinny piano was being played badly in the corner, and the low rumble of male voices filled the room. And there, standing behind the long, polished bar, was Josiah Finch himself. He was not what she had expected. He wasn't a hulking brute or a wild-eyed villain. He was a man of medium height, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit and a brocade vest, his silvering hair neatly combed. He had a clean-shaven, handsome face and a smile that seemed warm and genuine. He was pouring a whiskey for a dusty cowboy, laughing at something the man said. He looked civilized, respected. It made him all the more monstrous. Abigail approached the bar, keeping her head bowed. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice deliberately soft and trembling. I was hoping you might have some work. Any kind of work." Finch turned, and his blue eyes settled on her. They were intelligent, piercing eyes that seemed to take in her entire story, the worn dress, the thinness of her frame, the carefully crafted sorrow on her face in a single glance. "Well now, what have we here?" he said, his voice smooth as poured molasses. He gestured for her to come closer. "Lift your head, child. Let's have a look at you." Reluctantly, she raised her eyes to meet his. Her blood ran cold. He was studying her face, and for a terrifying second she thought she saw a flicker of recognition, a shadow of a memory. Had he seen her that clearly when he'd visited her father's farm? "You're new to Redemption?" He stated not a question. "Yes, sir. My husband." He passed on the trail. "Fever," she recited the lie, feeling flimsy and thin under his scrutiny. "I have nothing left. I'll do anything. Muck out stables, wash floors, laundry." Finch stroked his chin, his gaze never leaving her face. The saloon had gone quiet, all eyes on the exchange. Jedediah Kane, the foreman she'd seen in the canyon, was sitting at a corner table. He squinted at her, his brutish face a mixture of confusion and vague familiarity. She forced herself not to look at him, to focus only on Finch. Tragic Finch, said his voice dripping with synthetic sympathy. The West can be a cruel place for a woman alone. He leaned forward, his voice dropping. What was your name again? Sarah Connolly, sir. Sarah Connolly, he repeated, testing the name on his tongue. He smiled a slow, calculated expression that didn't reach his eyes. Well, Sarah, it so happens my regular cleaning girl ran off with a silver prospector last week. The rooms upstairs are a disgrace. The pay is next to nothing, but it includes a small room in the back and 1 meal a day. Do you think you can handle that? Oh, yes, sir, she said, flooding her voice with desperate gratitude. Thank you, sir. God bless you. Don't thank God. Thank me, Finch said with that same chilling smile. He turned to the bartender. Floyd, get Sarah here something to eat, and show her to the room in the back. She starts in the morning. As she was led away, she could feel Finch's eyes on her back. She hadn't fooled him. Not completely. He wasn't sure, but he was suspicious. He hadn't offered her a job out of kindness. He had brought her into his den to watch her. He wanted his potential enemy close, where he could see her, control her, and dispose of her if his suspicions were confirmed. The days that followed were a grueling test of her nerve. Her life became a cycle of drudgery. She scrubbed floors, changed soiled linen in the upstairs rooms, and served watery stew to the patrons. She kept her head down and her ears open. She learned the rhythms of the town, the names and faces of Finch's key men. There was Jedediah, his brutish enforcer. There was Floyd, the bartender, with shifty eyes who missed nothing. And there were a half-dozen others, hard men who moved with the casual menace of hired guns. They talked freely around her, dismissing her as a simple-minded, grieving widow. She was invisible, a ghost in their midst, just as Hastine had planned. She learned they were putting pressure on the last few independent homesteaders in the region, using threats and vandalism disguised as Indian trouble to drive them out. She heard whispers of a big strike in the Chuska Mountains on land that was by treaty part of the Navajo reservation. Her primary goal was to get into Finch's office. It was a locked room at the back of the saloon, a place he guarded jealously. She knew that whatever proof existed, maps, deeds, letters would be in there. She watched and waited, learning the routine. Finch always rode out of town on Wednesday afternoons, checking on his various claims and operations. He always took Jedediah with him. That was her window. On the third Wednesday, she put her plan into action. After Finch and Jedediah had ridden out, she approached Floyd, the bartender. She feigned a dizzy spell, pressing a hand to her forehead. "Mr. Floyd, I'm feeling awfully faint." "The heat, I think," she murmured. Floyd, annoyed at the interruption, grunted. "Go lie down for a bit, then." "But I'm docking your pay." "Thank you, sir. Could I trouble you for a glass of water first?" As he turned his back to work, the pump Abigail moved with a speed that would have shocked him. Her hand darted out, plucking the ring of keys that hung from a hook behind the bar. Among them was a heavy, ornate brass key, the key to Finch's office. She concealed it in the palm of her hand just as he turned back with the water. She drank it slowly, thanked him again, and walked unsteadily towards her small room in the back. Her heart was a frantic drum. Once inside her room, she didn't rest. She waited, listening for 5 agonizing minutes. Then, slipping out, she moved to the locked door of Finch's office. Her hand trembled as she inserted the key. It turned with a well-oiled click. She slipped inside, closing the door silently behind her, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through the grimy window. The office was a reflection of the man, orderly, opulent, and predatory. A large oak desk dominated the room. On the wall hung a taxidermied wolf, its glass eyes staring down with a permanent snarl. and on the desk, held down by a crystal paperweight, was a sheaf of papers. Her hands shook as she lifted the paperweight. The top document was a geological survey map. It showed the Chusca Mountains, and in the heart of the treaty-protected reservation land, an area was circled in red ink. The notation next to it read, Veta Madre, high-grade silver running north-south, the mother lode. Behind the map was a letter. It was correspondence from a Senator Thomas Reed in Washington. Her blood ran cold as she read it. Josiah, it began. The situation with the Navajo is becoming politically difficult. Your manufactured incidents are drawing scrutiny. You must provide a definitive reason for the army to intervene. A major, undeniable atrocity. Once the reservation is cleared for pacification, I can push through the treaty amendment, voiding their claim to the Chusca region. But you must give me the ammunition. The Hobbs massacre was a good start, but we need more. She felt sick. This wasn't just one greedy man. It was a conspiracy that went all the way to the capital. But it was the third document, a deed of sale, that made her gasp, a strangled sound of pure shock. It was a provisional deed, transferring ownership of the Hobbs homestead, her home, to a partnership. It was signed at the bottom by two men. One was Josiah Finch. The other signature belonged to her father, Thomas Hobbs. The floor seemed to drop out from under her. It was dated 2 months before the attack. Her father, a partner, he had sold them out. He had made a deal with the devil. The world tilted on its axis, every memory she had of her righteous, God-fearing father, twisting into a sickening new shape. This wasn't a simple story of good versus evil, of innocent victims and a clear villain. Her own family was tainted. Her quest for righteous vengeance was suddenly mired in the murky waters of her father's compromise. A note was scrawled at the bottom in Finch's handwriting, Hobbs threatening to talk, becoming a liability. Must be silenced. The family too. No witnesses. So that was it. Her father hadn't been a martyr. He'd been a partner who'd grown a conscience, a loose end that Finch needed to tie up. The attack hadn't been because he refused to sell. It had been because he'd agreed to sell, and then tried to back out. Footsteps sounded in the hallway. Heavy, hurried, Floyd. He must have noticed the missing keys. Abigail frantically put the papers back, but in her haste, she knocked over a small inkwell. Black ink bled across the corner of the desk, a dark stain of her intrusion. There was no time. She couldn't get out the way she came in. Her eyes darted around the room and landed on the window. It was a long drop to the filthy alley behind the saloon. The footsteps stopped outside the door. A key rattled in the lock. With no other choice, Abigail grabbed the incriminating letters, shoved them down the front of her dress, and threw open the window. She didn't look down. She just jumped. Abigail landed hard in the alley, a jolt of pain shooting up from her ankle. The ground was a foul mixture of mud-rotting garbage and shattered glass. A shout erupted from the office window above. "Hey, stop!" It was Floyd's voice, thick with alarm. Panic overrode the pain. She scrambled to her feet, her ankle screaming in protest, and forced herself into a limping run. She stumbled out of the alley and onto the main street, drawing startled looks from a few loiterers. She didn't look back. She couldn't. She just ran, her only thought to get to the hills, to the rocks, where Hastine had promised he would be watching. Behind her, the saloon doors burst open. She knows the Connolly woman. Get her Jedediah Kane's roar echoed through the town. It was a race. A crippled woman against men on the verge of mounting their horses. The edge of town seemed miles away. Every jarring step sent a fresh wave of agony through her leg. Her lungs burned. The conspiracy, the letter from the senator, the horrifying truth about her own father. It was all a chaotic storm in her mind, but survival was the only clear thought. The papers tucked into her dress felt like a block of ice against her skin, a heavy weight of truth that could either save her or get her killed. She reached the last of the buildings, the open rocky ground ahead, offering the only hope of cover. A gunshot cracked the air, and a splinter of wood flew from a fence post beside her head. They weren't trying to capture her anymore. Just as her vision started to blur and her legs threatened to give out completely, a figure rose from behind a cluster of boulders ahead. It was Hastine. He held his bow, an arrow already nocked. He was not looking at her but past her at her pursuers. He let the arrow fly. It was not aimed at a man, but at the horse Jedediah was hastily untying from a hitching post. The arrow struck the animal in the fleshy part of its flank. The horse screamed, reared violently, and bolted, dragging its reins and causing chaos among the other mounts. The move bought her precious seconds. Hastine ran to her, his face a grim mask. He saw her limp, the pain etched on her face. Without a word, he swept her up into his arms. She was shocked by his strength, the ease with which he carried her. "Hold on," he grunted, and then he was moving, not with the plodding steps of a man, but with the swift, ground-eating lope of a wolf. He didn't run towards the highest peaks, but down into a dry wash, a deep arroyo that would hide them from the town's line of sight. He knew this land, every dip and crevice, every shadow that could offer sanctuary. For nearly an hour he ran, his breathing steady, and deep, his pace never slackening. Abigail clung to him, the shock of her discovery in Finch's office giving way to the sheer adrenaline-fueled terror of the chase. She could hear the distant shouts of Finch's men, the sound of horses struggling on the rocky terrain. They were still coming. Finally, Hastine ducked into a narrow cleft in a canyon wall, an opening so small she would never have noticed it. It opened into a small hidden cave, barely large enough for two people. He gently set her down, his chest heaving slightly, the first sign of the tremendous exertion. "Your leg?" he said, his voice clipped as he examined her swollen ankle. "I'll live," she gasped, leaning back against the cool rock. "Hastine, I found it. I found everything." Her hands trembling, she pulled the papers from her dress. The map, the senator's letter, the deed with her father's signature. She handed them to him. He could not read English well, but he could understand maps and signatures. She explained what they meant, her voice cracking as she confessed the part about her father. He was in business with him. She whispered shame and grief warring within her. "My father. He wasn't the man I thought he was. Finch killed him because he was a liability." Hastine listened, his expression unreadable as she spoke. He looked at the deed at the name Thomas Hobbs next to Josiah Finch. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the cave entrance. "A man can be two things at once," he said finally, his voice quiet. "He can be a good father, and he can be a man who makes a bad choice. The choice does not erase the father. His final choice, to stand against Finch, is the one that mattered. It is the one that cost him his life. It is the one you should remember." His words were a strange comfort, a small point of light in her swirling confusion. He wasn't judging her father. He was a man who understood the world in shades of grey, not the stark black and white of her own upbringing. A rock clattered somewhere outside. Hastine was instantly alert. He peered through a tiny crack in the rock face. "Jedediah," he breathed. "And two others. They are close." Abigail's blood ran cold. They were trapped. The cave was a dead end. Hastine looked at her, then at the papers in his hand. He made a decision. He tucked the precious documents into his own leather pouch. "You have done your part," he said, his voice low and intense. "You were the ghost. You brought the truth out of the darkness." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her heart pounding. "Finch knows you have these," he said, tapping the pouch. "He will send all his men to hunt us. He will not rest until he has them back and we are dead. This is the end of the hunt, one way or another." He looked at her injured ankle. "You cannot run. You will stay here. Stay silent. Do not move until the sun sets twice." He handed her the canteen of water and the small pouch of dried food. It was all the supplies they had. "Where are you going?" she pleaded, a new fear gripping her, not for herself, but for him. "I am a hunter," he said, a grim smile touching his lips for the first time. "I have been the prey for too long. Now I will draw the wolves away from the lamb." He picked up his bow and the small quiver of arrows. He looked at her one last time, his dark eyes holding hers. There was no pity, but there was respect, an acknowledgement. They were no longer captor and captive white and Navajo. They were two survivors, bound by the same enemy, the same grief. "Stay alive, Abigail Hobbs," he said, using her real name for the first time. The sound of it was a reclamation, a return of her identity. Before she could reply, he slipped out of the cave entrance, as silent as a passing shadow. A moment later, she heard a sharp whistle from high up on the canyon rim, a deliberate sound designed to be heard. Then the sound of shouting from Finch's men and the thunder of horses' hooves giving chase. He was drawing them away, leading them on a deadly chase through the country. He knew better than they ever could. She was alone in the darkness of the cave, with nothing but the echo of her own name and the terrifying, uncertain fate of the Navajo warrior who had just saved her life. Abigail remained in the cave a prisoner of her own helplessness. The silence of the canyons was a constant torment, every gust of wind sounding like the hoofbeats of returning enemies. She thought not of her own survival, but of the wounded warrior leading Finch's men on a deadly chase. The complex knot of fear and resentment she once felt for Hastine had been replaced by a fierce, protective alliance. He was no longer her captor. He was the only other person in the world who knew the truth. On the evening of the second day, a shadow fell across the cave's entrance. She scrambled back, grabbing a rock as a weapon, but it was Hastine. He was a terrible sight, leaning heavily against the rock wall. A bloody gash ran down his cheek, and his arm was bound in a crude, soaked sling. But he was alive. In his eyes, the cold fire of vengeance now burned with a triumphant light. "Jedediah," she whispered, "he will not hunt again." Hastine said, his voice a low rasp of exhaustion. He had led them into a box canyon, a trap not for him, but for them. He had used his knowledge of the land to win, but it had cost him dearly. Finch will know his men are gone. He will come for the papers. For me. He struggled to sit upright, his face pale beneath his sun-darkened skin. "I cannot go to the fort. They would hang a Navajo before they read the first word." "But you can." He held out the packet of letters and maps. "Take these. Follow the river north. It leads to Fort Defiance. Tell your story. Tell mine." He was sending her to safety while he went to his death. The girl who had collapsed by a juniper tree weeks ago would have taken the papers and run. But that girl was gone, burned away in the fire of her homestead. "No," she said, her voice firm with a newfound strength. Hastine stared confused. "You said it yourself, they won't believe a lone woman. And you can't face him alone, not like this," she said, gesturing to his wounds. "Finch is a coward. He'll use a rifle from a distance, but he doesn't know everything." A memory sparked in her mind. "My father. He kept a second pistol, an old Colt Dragoon. He hid it under a loose stone in our hearth. Hasteen's eyes widened. He had a plan for vengeance. She had just given him a strategy for victory. Their journey back to her ruined homestead was a slow, painful pilgrimage, the two of them leaning on each other for support. When they arrived, the sight of the blackened cabin sent a pang of grief through Abigail, but it was quickly replaced by cold resolve. They found the heavy pistol wrapped in oilcloth, exactly where she said it would be. They didn't wait long. A lone rider appeared, approaching the ruins Josiah Finch, carrying a long Sharps rifle. He dismounted far from the cabin, using his horse for cover. "Hasteen," he shouted, his voice arrogant. "I know you're here. Give me the papers and I'll give you a quick death." From their hiding place in the stone-walled root cellar, Abigail knew this was the moment. Finch expected a long-range fight with a warrior armed with a bow. It was time for the ghost to walk one last time. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out into the open, her hands held high. Mr. Finch spun his face, a mask of pure shock. The dead girl was alive. "It's over," she called, her voice steady despite her hammering heart. "I sent the papers to Fort Defiance with a prospector this morning. They already know everything." It was a lie, but Finch's face contorted with doubt and fury. His perfect plan was unraveling. His attention was fixed entirely on her, the impossible witness. That was the only opening Hasteen needed. He burst from the other side of the ruins, not a distant target, but an avenging spirit closing the ground with stunning speed. Finch fumbled to turn the long rifle, but he was too slow. The heavy Colt Dragoon roared, once its deafening boom echoing across the valley. Josiah Finch fell his conspiracy, dying with him in the dust. Silence descended. Hasteen stood over the body, not triumphant, but empty. He walked to the river where his own family had been slain and washed the blood from his hands. He took the papers from his pouch and handed them to Abigail. "My fight is done," he said, his voice quiet. "Yours is just beginning." "What will you do?" she asked softly. "I will mourn," he said, his gaze distant. "And I will help my people rebuild. Because of you, the truth will be told." He turned to leave. "Hasteen," she called. He stopped but did not turn. "Thank you." He gave a slight nod and walked away, disappearing into the mesas that were his home. He never looked back. Abigail Hobbs stood alone, holding the truth in her hands. She had lost everything, but she had found a strength she never knew she possessed. She was no longer a victim. She was a survivor with a long walk ahead and a story that would change everything. The story of Abigail Hobbs and the Navajo warrior Hasteen is not just a tale of revenge, but a stark reminder of the hidden histories buried in the American West. It's a story about how justice is rarely clean and how true courage is often found in the most unlikely alliances. The line between victim and survivor, between savage and civilized, is often written not in law books, but in the dust and blood of the frontier. What happened to Abigail after she reached Fort Defiance? Did Senator Reed face justice? The official records are silent, but legends like these persist, passed down to remind us that the fight against greed and hatred is timeless. If this story of survival, betrayal, and unthinkable choices resonated with you, please help us keep these histories alive. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more tales from the forgotten corners of the Wild West. Your support allows us to continue unearthing these incredible narratives. Thank you for listening.